Good morning for our colleagues in Southeast Asia, good afternoon for people in Hawaii, and good evening for our colleagues across the continent of the U.S. I'm Miriam Stark, and I'm the director for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And today, it is my great honor to welcome you all to listen to an interview between Scot Marciel, Ambassador Scot Marciel, and Dr. Kevin Woods about a book that was just published called Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. I'll provide just a brief introduction or background to Ambassador Marciel, and then a briefer one to Kevin Woods, who will then take over as moderator. So Ambassador Marciel was an Oxenberg Roland Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, affiliated with the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and is currently now at Stanford, where he says he'll be for some time. Previously, he served as a visiting scholar and visiting practitioner fellow on Southeast Asia at APARC, and he's a retired diplomat with many years of experience in the region. Mr. Marciel served as U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar from March 2016 to May 2020, leading a mission of 500 employees during the very difficult Rohingya democratic crisis and challenging time for both Myanmar's democratic transition and the U.S.-Myanmar relationship. Before serving in Myanmar, Ambassador Marciel served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the State Department, where he oversaw U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. We can go back many years before that, but he's a career diplomat with 35 years of experience in Asia and around the world. He has served at U.S. missions in Turkey, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Brazil, and the Philippines. At the State Department in Washington, he served as the Director of the Office of Maritime Southeast Asia, Director of the Office of Mainland Southeast Asia, and Director of the Office of Southern European Affairs. He was also Deputy Director of the Office of Monetary Affairs and the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. With credentials behind him and deep experience, he comes to us to talk about his book, Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. We're very honored to host him and to have Dr. Kevin Woods from the East-West Center's research program. Kevin has more than 20 years experience himself in Myanmar. And of course, these colleagues are old friends. So I'm going to now pass the torch to Kevin, and thank you both for talking with us today.
Thanks, Miriam, for the introductions. And it's an honor to be the moderator with Scot Marciel about his recent book publication. The format that we're going to use today is I'm just going to ask a series of questions. Some of them are a bit long-winded to kind of get basically to get Scot talking about his book and the many different facets that it brings up. I hope some of the participants who are on who have joined us today have had a chance to look at it or read it. And I think this will be, for those of you who haven't read the book, it will allow us to kind of dive deep into both Scot's personal experiences in Southeast Asia and as a U.S. Diplomat in several of the countries that he was ambassador for, as well as more generally about U.S. Southeast Asia diplomatic relations, China, ASEAN. There's a lot going on in the book. And so it's going to be a very dynamic discussion for the first 45 minutes to an hour using this format. And then for the last about 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to open the floor up to questions from those who are joining us today. So during the discussion, please think about potential questions that you would like to ask Scot. I will kind of also moderate and vet those questions. So please think of those questions and post them as you think of them. So, without further ado, I kind of the first two questions I have for you, Scot, are a bit more general, just to kind of get the conversation going. And so I'd like to hear from you on why you wanted to write this book in the first place after you finished your term as U.S. ambassador in Myanmar, where I got to know you a bit. What were your overall aims and objectives in writing the book? And I also, relatedly, would be interested to hear on why you chose this particular writing approach or style, which I found rather unique in terms of it was kind of part history, part memoir, part recommended U.S. policy prescriptions, all together in one book. So let's start there.
Okay, thanks, Kevin, and thanks everybody for having me for this interview and for joining to join the discussion. Why did I write the book? Well, I after Myanmar, I had an opportunity to come to Stanford and kind of get a little bit of break from the day to day work of diplomacy and try to zoom out a little bit, if you will, and take a bigger look at things. And when I got to Stanford, I didn't really plan on writing a book until I got to Stanford and they said, "We need you to write a book." Which was rather daunting because when you work for the State Department, you don't really write anything longer than about 3 or 4 pages at a time. So I thought about it and I said, well, I have to think about what I should write about. They said, well, write about your experience in Southeast Asia. So, it took me a while to figure out how I wanted to do it, but I didn't want it to be sort of an academic book because I'm not an academic. I don't have that skill set. I'm a policy person, and so I didn't want to try to force myself into a genre that I wasn't really familiar with or capable of. And I also didn't want to write it as a memoir because for me, to write a memoir, you have to have either the most amazing career ever or a massive ego, or maybe both. And I knew the first one was not the case, and I was pretty sure the second wasn't the case. So what I decided to do was to try to write an analytical book, but throw in some of my own personal experiences and observations just to kind of make it a little bit more real and maybe add a little bit of a human touch and occasionally even a few attempts at humor, some funny situations. So that's how I came up with that unique style, I guess, or unusual style. And I guess because I had never written a book before, I didn't feel a certain pattern that I had to write. And then once I started thinking about it and, doing research and talking to more people and thinking about how to write it, I thought, as you know, there's a real shortage of books, at least in the United States, about Southeast Asia, and certainly about current issues in U.S. Southeast Asian relations. So I thought that my book could help fill a little bit of the gap there in terms of literature, by looking at that situation in a number of Southeast Asian countries, the ones I was most familiar with, had spent the most time in, and also talking about stepping back and looking at what the U.S. and Southeast Asia had maybe got right and areas for improvement.
Thank you for that. I will say it's you're in a unique position for a university and a press to plead with you to write and publish a book for them. Others of us have to go all over pleading with university presses to please publish what we have written. So consider yourself pretty lucky.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was one of those things where ignorance was a blessing for me.
So why don't you give us the kind of key takeaway messages that the book touches upon for your readers? And I'm assuming that your readership will span from academics to policy makers to diplomats and development practitioners. So what are these messages that kind of emerge repeatedly in the book? And why do you feel these messages matter to U.S. Southeast Asia relations today and in the near future? And I would be remiss to add how you think next week's U.S. presidential elections could impact these relations. I had to ask that one. Sorry, Scott.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, I think when I wrote the book, probably the bulk of the book is actually looking at U.S. relations with individual countries. So, there's a couple chapters on the Philippines, on Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and ASEAN. So each of those kind of dive into those particular relations. But broadly, the key messages out of the book are that if you look at the last 30 or 40 years, particularly since the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. kind of lost the strategic prism through which it viewed Southeast Asia. There was no longer an enemy that might energize and direct U.S. strategy in the region. And so for beginning in the 1990s, 2000s, a lot of the focus was on, promoting human rights, democracy. It was focused on trade issues a lot. And, the relations were sometimes good, sometimes bad, but the lack of a strategic focus meant it was often hard to get senior U.S. officials to pay a lot of attention to the region. There were exceptions, during Indonesia's transformation, during the normalization process with Vietnam, the effort to get a peace agreement in Cambodia. There would be a flurry of attention, but overall it was pretty inconsistent attention to the region. And, so that was one message. Two is that even though I would argue that the relationships overall between the United States and the countries of Southeast Asia brought a lot of benefits to both sides, economic, security, and cultural, people to people, etc. When you talk to people in Southeast Asia much, or you talk to people in Washington for many years, there's been a sort of a sense of disappointment that with the other, with you're talking to American officials, there's sort of a sense of disappointment with Southeast Asia and vice versa. From the American side, the disappointment is a lot in the area of democratic regression, a perception of a failure to make much progress on human rights and governance, those sorts of things. And more recently, some disappointment with ASEAN's inability, from the Washington perspective, to sort of stand up to Chinese assertiveness, and particularly in the South China Sea. And and some frustration with, how to deal with ASEAN. Why do I fly halfway around the world to go to these meetings that don't accomplish anything? And then from the Southeast Asia perspective, obviously it varies by country, but some unhappiness with the inconsistent U.S. engagement. So which, raise questions. How much can we count on the Americans? Are they really our long-term partners? And also with the U.S. tendency to lecture, particularly in areas like human rights, and sometimes do a lot of talking and not a lot of listening. And more recently, with perception that the U.S. is underperforming in terms of economic initiatives, particularly on the trade side, vis-a-vis, say, China or Japan or others. So you've got this sense of disappointment on both sides. And I guess the key argument I make is, despite that, it's really in the interest of both Southeast Asia and the United States to double down and try to invest more to strengthen these relationships for a lot of reasons, economic and otherwise. But from a strategic perspective, with the rise of China, and this is not a book that's bashing China, but with the rise of China, that means there's a lot more gravitational pull from China for all of the Southeast Asian countries. And it's in, I think, the interest of Southeast Asians and the United States for the U.S., as well as other countries, to be engaged sufficiently and strong enough partners with those countries that gravitational pull from China doesn't get overwhelming. And it doesn't mean they have to side with the U.S. It's more the argument that to the extent these relationships are stronger, it gives more freedom of maneuver for the countries of Southeast Asia. They can work with China as much or as little as they want, with us as much as little or as little as they want. And that's in the U.S. interest. It's the U.S. strategy should not be win these guys over, but rather do everything possible to bolster their ability to maintain full autonomy, independence, freedom of maneuver, as well as to work with us in economics and so on. And so, based on that, there's a number of recommendations for the U.S. That I recommend. Most starting with consistent engagement at senior levels, timely, given that President Biden has just missed the East Asia Summit, or has just announced that he will miss the East Asia Summit. And really stepping up the economic game, continuing to work in areas that have been really positive: security, health cooperation, all those sorts of things. There's a whole list of recommendations I won't go into, and that's strategically valuable for both most of Southeast Asia and for the United States. As for and I think the reason it's timely, I hope it's timely, is because it's very clear that the countries of Southeast Asia are trying to avoid getting caught in this U.S. China competition, trying to work with both. And we can make it easier for them to accomplish that by following these recommendations. As for the U.S. elections, I think if you get a Harris administration, you're likely to see more continuity, sort of a continuity of the Obama-Biden years, more or less. I'm sure there'll be some changes, but I wouldn't think dramatic. With Trump, it's a little bit harder to tell. I mean, he's more of a transactional politician. And this time, if he wins again, in my view, he's less likely to be surrounded or have in place really experienced, highly qualified people in key positions to help sort of guide the ship. And so the potential for more erratic policies is certainly a possibility, and for trade policies that are not only, a failure or unwillingness to move forward, but actually could result in major trade distortions with tariffs and the sort.
Thanks for that. Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
You mentioned freedom to maneuver.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I don't know if others were also
Right.
want to have some clarification on what that means.
Sure. Yeah, and what I mean by that is that I think that the U.S. strategic goal should be to do everything possible to support strong, independent, peaceful, prosperous countries in Southeast Asia and the whole region. And rather than trying to discourage them from engaging or working with China, try to make sure that they have the choice to do what they want, not be sort of feel pressured where they have to always accommodate China. And so that's what I mean by freedom of maneuver, that if the government of whichever country says, yeah, we really want to do this with China, okay, we may like it or not like it, but it's at least a free choice, as opposed to, we don't want to do this, or we don't like what China's doing, but we don't have any alternative but just to accept it. So freedom of maneuver in that sense.
Thanks for clarifying that. Obviously, China is an important discussion point in the book and for our talk today. Just to let you and our participants know that we'll kind of be touching on China more towards the end of the questions that I have. But I'm excited to hear more about the China in with U.S. Southeast Asia relations, but let's just hold off on that for now. So I'd like to kind of tilt to history for a bit. I guess this is partially my own bias of thinking it's really important to think about historical legacies in contemporary relations. But for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read the book, the beginning of every country chapter kind of starts with a longer historical arc, mostly starting with the Cold War, but in some cases, Scott includes a brief review of the country's experience with colonialism and World War II that was pertinent to the story that he was trying to tell. So I wanted to hear more from you on why you think it was important to historicize contemporary U.S. relations in Southeast Asia, despite the book being anchored on your diplomatic experiences that started post-Cold War. So what was the thought process in terms of your approach to that?
Yeah, I think the main reason, the main driver, Kevin, was that my own view, based on my own experience, that if you don't know the history of the country that you're working in and of the relationship, you're guaranteed to make a lot more mistakes and to miss a lot of things. Now, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be an expert on the entire history of a country, but you need to know a fair amount. And so in this book, it just seemed to me essential to talk about, current U.S. Philippine relations, or certainly U.S. Vietnam relations, with some discussion of the history. And it's not meant to be a history book per se, but I just don't think you can. I couldn't think of a way to just start discussing the current issues or the current state of the relationship without touching, and in some cases describing at some length, some of the background. I mean, the U.S. Thailand relationship is another great example, or the U.S. Indonesia relationship, where with Sukarno, it was pretty tense at times, and that still colors U.S. actions in the 1950s, and Indian perceptions of those actions still color Indonesian attitudes toward the United States to some extent, not in a particularly positive way.
Um, so with that in mind, of this is not a history book, but nonetheless, like, how do we talk about contemporary issues without starting with kind of the historicize these relations? Um, I'm wondering if you could speak to how you navigated writing about Southeast Asia's varied post-colonial Cold War and post-Cold War histories from the perspective of a U.S. diplomat, which is, the your identity in this book, compared to, for example, an academic historian or writing history from social sciences and humanities, and what sort of unique perspective that you provided us based on your diplomatic experiences, as well as, frankly, what that could gloss over. And I'm thinking particularly here about this. I have to say, what I read is kind of seeming benevolence, that my reading of how you bestowed benevolence in the U.S. government and their political involvement in the countries in the region, from colonialism in the Philippines to the Cold War and post-Cold War development in the region as a whole, which, critical scholars and writers tend to write these histories a bit differently than how I read it in your book. So I would like to hear your response to my provocative question, please.
Sure. I mean, because my time in the region didn't begin until the mid 1980s, so I had to do research. I mean, I interviewed some people, and I basically just tried to look at a variety of sources to get the basic history. Again, the thrust of the book wasn't to do new discoveries of that history, but to try to, if you will, summarize it, to provide some context for the current situation. So I just, relied on different articles, books, etc., to try to go over that. As for bestowing a certain benevolence on U.S. actions, I don't know. I mean, I felt like I was pretty honest, and a number of people commented to me that they were surprised how critical I was of the U.S. Although a lot of that may have been more recent policy. So I I tried to be as objective as I could. I wasn't writing at it trying to make the case for the U.S. because then it'd have no credibility. Um, and I think, for example, in the Philippines, I didn't talk about colonialism a lot. I did address it and pointed out that having a colony is never a good thing. Um, and certainly the history of Indonesia and so on, covered it. But again, the goal was just to provide sort of a basic historical context. And I, as I said, try to make it as objective as I could. And I'm, welcome people's corrections or different disagreements or whatever with what I wrote.
Um, kind of in a similar vein, and also going back to your response to the previous question I had, in this U.S. shift from, well, during the Cold War, right? It's a very particular political period of U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia. The heart of the struggle of, to not make it too stark, but I mean, capitalism versus communism, and the U.S. Supporting many authoritarian regimes that were known at the time and certainly afterwards to be responsible for atrocious human rights abuses during that time, to
Yeah,
then post-Cold War, the U.S. very quickly refashioning uh, the U.S. kind of approach to the region in protecting democracy, human rights, religious freedom during the 1990s. And in reading the book, repeatedly in each country chapter, it was such a kind of a real stark juxtaposition
yeah.
uh, between these periods. And so I'm wondering how did you find that challenging navigating this stark juxtaposition in your capacity as a diplomat and in writing the book?
Um, Not too much, to be honest, and that may be because I started my diplomatic career, very near the end of the Cold War. So by the time I was in a position to have any authority at all, we were well into that new chapter, if you will. I think I wrote in the chapter, the first chapter on the Philippines. I wrote about arriving in the Philippines in 1985 when President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was a dictator and human rights record was terrible and corruption, and being really troubled that why are we still supporting this guy, and having conversations in the embassy with that. But two things. One, I mean, the Philippine people kind of took care of that by kicking him out after I'd been there maybe 8 or 10 months. And two, only later did I realize that behind the scenes, quietly, the U.S. was in the middle of moving from a staunch supporter of Marcos to recognizing that he was as much the problem as anything else. And then I guess the other time it was a particular challenge was when I was early in my career working on the Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia desk during the period we were working with Indonesia and other countries on the Cambodia peace accords. And at that time, we were still supporting the Cambodian resistance, a group of three different groups, one of which was the Khmer Rouge. And we were saying, well, we don't support the Khmer Rouge, but we're supporting the more pro-democracy elements to that, which was a very problematic approach. And so that was uncomfortable. Again, fortunately, that things moved ahead in Cambodia pretty quickly. Obviously, it wasn't an ideal result when we look at the situation in Cambodia now, but at least we weren't supporting the Khmer Rouge.
Thanks. Those are exactly the two cases that I wanted you to speak to in my question with the Philippines and the resistance forces in Cambodia against Vietnam occupation. I would like to follow up on a very poignant question that some audience members may be thinking of who are history buffs. But do you think that our support during that time in Cambodia could have led, as some people assert, to the legitimacy of the Khmer Rouge and kept them in power longer?
Uh,
It's a big
well,
question. I
yeah,
recognize.
I don't know. I mean, I think trying to remember my dates and my facts, but um, by the time I got involved in it, which was, like 1990, so the Vietnamese had been in Cambodia for more than a decade. So there wasn't really the prospect of the Khmer Rouge staying in power. It was more, how can we even indirectly how can we be supporting an alliance that includes the Khmer Rouge? And that was clearly driven by the Cold War and this perception in the 70s and 80s that Vietnam was part of this, was the pointy spear at the tip of the Soviet-backed communist expansion, and that outweighed almost everything. And I, in hindsight, I was like, what were we thinking? From my perspective. But
I think a lot of people were thinking that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that you would applaud the Vietnamese. I mean, I love the Vietnamese. I don't think they invaded the Cambodia because they were concerned about Khmer Rouge human rights violations. They invaded because of Khmer Rouge provocations along their border. That said, was it a bad thing that that they got rid of the Khmer Rouge? Not so bad to me. So that's in hindsight, but I wasn't around at the time, so I never was in those discussions.
Thanks for allowing me to ask some harder questions.
Sure.
Okay, let's kind of move forward in time, and I'd like to ask you a series of questions on U.S. diplomatic relations and during the past decade or two, and kind of looking forward. You mentioned earlier about some people commented they were surprised of some of your critical comments of U.S. Relations currently in your writing. And so with that in mind, I would like to hear from you on what you thought the United States gets wrong in Southeast Asia, or I should say got wrong, and what does it still get wrong, and what should we learn from our past mistakes?
Yeah. One is, and I it's hard for me as a former diplomat to be too critical, particularly because in some cases I was one of the people who got it wrong. But I'd start with the big picture. The lack of appreciation sometimes at very senior levels of the importance of convincing somewhat skeptical Southeast Asian leaders and governments that the U.S. is a committed long-term partner, which involves, among other things, showing up consistently and engaging on the wide variety of issues that are of importance to the region. And so when we've tended to be to show up for a while and then not show up so much, and that undermines trust and confidence in the region, in the United States writ large. So that's one. Two is, I think in some specific circumstances, like the Thai coups of 2006 and 2014, both of which I was involved from the Washington perspective, where we were criticized by a lot of Thai friends in 2006 for not reacting strongly enough to the coup, and then criticized by some of the same people for reacting, quote, too strongly to the coup in 2014. I don't think the trouble is so much responding harshly to the 2014, or critically to the 2014 coup, because it was very problematic. But then there's a tendency in Washington, with officials, but also egged on by advocacy groups and often Capitol Hill, to demonstrate unhappiness by just pulling away and not engaging. And there are, it's so striking the balance, specifically in the case of Thailand. I think we pulled away too much, in 2014. There's some things by law we had to do, like with a coup, you have to cut off military assistance. So we didn't have a choice on that. And I'm not saying that you should just treat it as business as usual, but we tend to go to, sometimes the opposite extreme and basically disengage. Now, the Prayut government at that time, frankly, didn't make it very easy for us to engage. But nonetheless, if I had to offer advice again, if that were to happen, I would have said, let's keep plugging away, keep the channels of communication open more, and try to work for the simple reason that it's not effective to pull away like that. There's an exception, which I'll get to in a minute, but it's generally, imposing sanctions and saying we're not going to talk to you doesn't really change behavior, usually. And then you're left sort of 4 or 5 years later, if nothing changes, you're like, kind of, well, okay, that didn't work. Let's try something else. The exception is Myanmar right now. Or I think pulling away and not engaging with the generals is exactly the right approach, because these guys are beyond the pale. And there's no evidence at all that engaging with them would bring about any change in behavior. Some people disagree with that, but that's my pretty strong view.
I was actually getting ready to push you on Myanmar if that follows your advice. So you beat me to it, and I'm glad that well, I'll leave it at that. Well, you mentioned, okay, well, so basically, let's go deeper into that with this kind of the style of U.S. engagement that you're advocating for. It comes up in the book regularly. The way that you write the book is mostly through your personal experience, right, as a long-term diplomat. And then we get these kind of cameos throughout the book of other Southeast Asia longtime regional diplomats that you have worked with. And so we get this continual strong message of the longevity of U.S. institutional memory and legacy in the region through these individuals. And when I say individuals, I probably should say men, because until Hillary Clinton appears in the book, it is all men. And I think until Obama appears in the book, I'm pretty sure these are all white men, which, is something also to something to comment on. But this speaks to a really important message that I got in reading the book, is on building trust through person-to-person relations, as well as the importance of area studies. This is the Center for Southeast Asia Studies at UH, after all. And so my question is, does your book speak actually to a bygone era that is maybe more tied to your generation? And I'm honestly not trying to make you sound older than you are, because you're not. But I was reading it, and this hasn't been my experience in kind of meeting U.S. missions who continually change every 2 to 3 years. And almost everyone that I have met in the embassy working on Myanmar has never worked on anything on Myanmar, or oftentimes not even in the region. And likewise, we're having a continual demise of area studies on our campuses. And so I'm just kind of wondering, like, if I have this right or wrong, and what does this mean for the type of diplomacy that you are strongly advocating for your book moving forward with future diplomatic missions? Is this kind of vision of engagement realistic and achievable? You can go many ways with this question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't always have to, the engagement doesn't always have to be deeply experienced, knowledgeable people who speak the language, or, have lived in the country for, years or something like that. Sometimes new engagement can be really productive. I mean, we have tremendous engagement in the region, for example, in health. And I guess it's the health expertise that brings people together rather than the particular country expertise. And that's a really underappreciated part of what I would consider diplomacy and foreign relations, the health partnerships that we're building. We can do similar things in green energy and climate change, and I don't think they need to be necessarily old hands, if you will. In terms of more traditional diplomacy, I think it is important to have at least some people in our embassies or dealing with the country who have some level of experience dealing with that country and some background. And this is where area studies really kicks in too, because everybody going out to the embassies should have, my view was whenever I went to a new country, and I never served in the same country twice, it's always a really steep learning curve. Of course, I just read everything I could find, and plus area studies, and then obviously you get there and you still know relatively little, but at least you've got something. And so emphasizing that area studies, I agree with you, is hugely important. In fact, as I was writing the book, I was thinking, I hope it would be useful for people, whether diplomats or others going out to a country or the region for the first time. And I think in a lot of countries, if you go to China or even Thailand or Vietnam, you tend to find more people in our embassies who've been there before. Places like Myanmar, for a long time, we had just a very small embassy there. So the number of people who've served there is relatively small. And then, as you know, and it's hard to find a lot of good books on Myanmar as well. So, it presents a challenge for us, and particularly these days with a very difficult situation. It's people are not going to be staying at the embassy for a really long time in most cases, particularly people with families and so on. So that hurts us, and it's not even a criticism; it's just a fact. And so it is really important to try as much as possible to at least get some a number of people in each embassy who really know the place pretty well.
That's actually a really good point. I kind of didn't really realize that Myanmar was an outlier in terms of the long-term engagements, whereas other countries that have more, a sustained historical relationship with the U.S. or as a easier post might have more longevity with the staff that are part of the missions there. But point taken. Relatedly, I'm wondering what this kind of this long-term, serious, sustained engagement that you advocate for, what this means in a region that has actually a really, I think by most accounts we can say challenging political context to advance U.S. quote unquote U.S. interests.
Mm-hmm.
Just for our audience members, to review what I see as a situation, the Myanmar military junta has always considered the U.S. to be one of their biggest enemies in the world. Cambodian government, pretty similar these days. Pretty minimal relationship with Laos. Mm-hmm. Thailand is kind of too busy dealing with their own political crisis, and especially seems rather nonchalant about U.S. support after, as Scott mentioned, the U.S. government heavily criticized the 2014 coup. Vietnam, incredible to see such a deepening relationship despite Vietnam still being communist. Maybe they're a little pissed off about being denied the highest trade status that we recently denied them. Indonesia is trying to deal with creating an entirely separate commodity supply chain that does not involve China in order for them to export minerals and
Mm-hmm.
other commodities to the U.S. market under Biden's new legislation, and so on and so forth. This is a challenging political environment, and I'm wondering, given that context, like, what does that mean for this vision that you're advocating for in terms of the type of U.S. Diplomatic relations that you want to see more?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of taking a long-term view, patience, persistence, spending a lot of time, trying to understand the thinking of the Cambodia or Thailand or whatever, both the government and others, and recognizing that you don't solve a lot of the issues right away. You've got to just keep working at them, and you need to stay engaged, finding areas of cooperation. In almost all of these countries, we have multiple areas of cooperation, even if the political level diplomatic relations aren't always as good. So, the business sector plays a really important role here too, having business ties. I mentioned health, environment, law enforcement, maybe in other areas, security, looking for opportunities in all these areas. I think in some ways, as I was writing the book, I thought that the U.S. Vietnam development of that relationship over the last 30 years is it's maybe not a model, that would be too strong of a word, but it's a great example of two countries that started off obviously about as far apart as you could be, and with a very, very troubled history between them, and just gradually building some confidence and trust, and building the relationships and expanding areas of cooperation, not shying away from areas of disagreement like human rights, but not letting those define the relationship. It's really, I think, a good example of two governments being very pragmatic and having a long-term vision. You don't always get that, but I think that's a great example. So yeah, it's take Cambodia. And I love Cambodia. And every time I would go to Cambodia, I would think, yeah, this country has problems, but my God, they survived the Khmer Rouge. Good for them that they're even functioning as a society after what the Khmer Rouge did. So, yeah, there's a lot of problems in at the political level in that relationship, and you just have to keep plugging away. You get people. I was in the government when people would sometimes say, just write off Cambodia. It's like, no, don't write off a country. You never know what's going to happen. And there are a lot of, it doesn't have to be just relations with government. It could be relations with other political figures, with civil society, with universities, with scientists. There's a lot of people. So when we think of engagement, it's not just with governments. And in particular, when the relationship with the government is not particularly fruitful or warm, you might even do more to try to build ties, because you never know how things are going to develop and shake out. And you look at the Philippines under President Duterte, it was a pretty troubled relationship. Now it's looking really good. So you have to avoid the short-term overreactions and stick with you're investing your time and your energy and your effort.
Thanks for that. I appreciated that response. Okay, with the last remaining 10 minutes or so, I wanted to turn to what is often considered the elephant in the room in terms of these conversations, China. You have a chapter on China. And as I was reading through, I just kept thinking like, okay, well, when are we going to start talking about China, which is also an interest of mine in the region. So in what you wrote, and also based on my own experiences in Myanmar and in readings, it seems that China's, and correct me if I'm wrong, China supports whoever is in power and also maintains relations with those that could potentially secure power in those countries in the near future. And I would say that they're extremely deft at this strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So just for the case of Myanmar, China supported the Tatmadaw, but then happily flip-flopped to the NLD when NLD got in power, and then now is back to loosely supporting the Tatmadaw since the coup, all the while they're maintaining regular dialogue with most of the ethnic armed organizations in the
Mm-hmm.
country, some of whom they supposedly support and arm. So can you speak to how that compares to U.S. diplomatic strategies in the region? And
Yeah.
also, sorry, one more question. Relatedly, what does the U.S. and China's different engagement approaches bring to the table? Like those differences, what does that mean for Southeast Asia as a region and for its people?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean you're right. I mean China first. I mean it's as a neighbor, it's right there, and it tends to be very active in all of Southeast Asia at the political and diplomatic level and economically. It tends to have a very, I guess you could call it pragmatic approach of basically dealing with whichever government happens to be in power, no matter how they got there. The Myanmar example you cited is exactly right. They switched very adroitly to support Aung San Suu Kyi's government and developed a good relationship with it. And then during the Rohingya crisis, when we were very critical, they furthered their influence by basically saying, we don't mind what you do with the Rohingya. So the U.S. can't do that because our body politic would never sort of say, hey, just ignore what happened to the Rohingya. But it presents some advantages to China. It also can be a disadvantage at times when, like right now, I would argue that they're alienating a lot of people in Myanmar. But overall, it's been pretty effective. And then they combine that with a lot of economic activity, including things like Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of financing for infrastructure, that sort of thing, which is another thing that the U.S. doesn't do very much. So I think for the countries of the region, pretty much across the board, they work with China. It's an important partner. They appreciate the sort of unconditional engagement of China in terms of their domestic politics. At the same time, China can be pretty heavy-handed at times. I mean, most notably in the South China Sea, but in other cases as well, like when they're telling the world not to interfere in Myanmar while they're interfering on a daily basis. And people see that and aren't all that happy with it. And there's certainly, according to the surveys of Southeast Asians, there's a fairly decent level of concern that with China's growing influence and how it might use it, and some unhappiness with the lack of concern for labor standards, environmental standards related to investments, these sorts of things, resources, something very well, Kevin. And in the United States, I think there's some appreciation for our concerns about human rights and labor rights and the environment and social issues and whatever. In some cases, a real appreciation among a lot of people for standing up for human rights. Governments may not always like it, but often many people do. At the same time, as I said, they would prefer more steady engagement rather than the sort of episodic engagement we sometimes are guilty of. And they would like to see more on the economic side. And a great example is with clean energy and climate change, where the U.S. and Japan negotiated this big deal with Indonesia, a just energy transition partnership to help Indonesia accelerate its movement toward a carbon neutral energy situation. But very frustrated because Washington struggled to come up with any actual money for it, and that's unfortunately recently been a more common theme. So I think the countries I've worked with and worked on, they see some value in what they get from China, some value in what they see from us. Certainly, they appreciate on the security side what we do, but also they want more, and so they're reaching out to Japan and Korea and India and Australia and each other to try to bolster those relations and avoid getting caught between the United States and China.
Yeah, thanks for that. I especially appreciated your comments on kind of the economics of those engagements, especially vis-a-vis China's Belt and Road Initiative and pumping billions of dollars of infrastructure development into the region. Not to say that's not itself problematic, but at the same time, and then where's the U.S. in terms of these large scale investments? And I wasn't aware of the Indonesia case that you mentioned. That oftentimes, even when maybe there is promises of these types of investments, they come up short. And I think that really gets at kind of the challenge of the U.S. really being present in the way that the people in Southeast Asia may want the U.S. to be present. and how that oftentimes pales in comparison to what China is materially providing. Again, not without its own challenges. Just one more question on China. And also, I want to remind our listeners to please post questions that we'll get to in just a few minutes. So please start writing your questions. Right. So you write in your book, and I've also heard many times in the region myself, and you brought this up earlier with the freedom of maneuver, not to force Southeast Asian governments or its people to have to choose between China and the U.S. Presumably because they would choose the governments would choose China if they had to choose, given it's it's impossible to ignore their big neighbor to the north. So it's all actually in your book. I forget if it what institute it was, but several times you list the surveys, annual survey results that were kind of gauging Southeast Asia citizens, kind of what they thought of U.S. and China and other foreign policies on several issues, not only investment, but security and human rights and so forth. I would like you to speak more to how these findings should shape U.S. engagements in the region and the ongoing U.S.-China power struggle in Southeast Asia. You also obviously can go in many directions with this question.
Yeah, sure. I think it's the ISIS Ishak Institute out of Singapore that does this annual survey. I mean, they're surveying not everyday people, but sort of opinion shapers, people in government, business, academia, and so on. So it's not necessarily fully representative of populations as a whole, but it's still, still very useful. I think, it's really important for U.S. policymakers to look at this stuff and take it seriously. I think U.S. officials I've worked with over the years do really believe, for the most part, that we are trying to be helpful, that we are trying to do good things. And so sometimes there's a bit of a blind spot to the wariness or skepticism that some people in Southeast Asia might have, whether it's based on what happened in the past or whatever. And so I think reading these surveys, as well as just listening to people, is helpful to make sure that we're not, deluding ourselves in terms of how we're viewed. I tend to think, based on my experience, that the U.S. is still generally viewed relatively favorably, maybe more than China by a lot of people. But it's by no means, it's by no means a situation where, everybody thinks America is just all good. And so it is really important to look at these surveys and maybe not overreact to them, but certainly consider them and think, what do we need to do to address these perceptions, to the extent sometimes they're just pretty factual. I mean, China is more influential economically than the United States in Southeast Asia. So we shouldn't be upset when we see that. It's just a recognition of the reality. But in other cases, it should be, wow, we thought we were doing a pretty good job in this area. Obviously, we need to do more. Again, it's a challenge. I think there's always, people who say, hey, we need to do X, Y, and Z. There's plenty of people who think we should be doing more on the trade front. The trouble is the politics in Washington right now aren't favorable to doing trade deals. And so the experts, the people who are really interested in Southeast Asia, they almost all would advocate for doing some kind of more serious trade deals in Southeast Asia, but they just can't get the political support to make it happen.
Great. Thank you. We're getting more questions popping in, and so I'm happy to kind of let's shift to bringing the participants' own questions in. And although this was one of the last questions posted, it's directly related to your last response. So I'm actually going to start there. and it's from a former Cambodia desk officer, which is nice. They are referring to the State of Southeast Asia 2024 ISEAS report, of which you were just talking about. So this year's, and it shows that China has become just barely the prevailing choice of the region if they were forced to choose between China and the US. I mean, it's essentially the same, 50.5% for China, 49.5% for the US. But what Shannon Dorsey is highlighting is what struck her is that last year it was only 39% for China and 61% for the US. And so what just happened?
Gaza.
Oh, one word answer. Powerful.
I think that was, I mean, I'm speculating here, but certainly that Gaza, if you know, if you look at the specifics per country, I'm pretty sure that our popularity in Indonesia and Malaysia and Brunei in particular has suffered significantly because of Gaza. And hi, Shannon, by the way. So yeah, I think that's a reality. I didn't overreact to that. Some people got pretty worked up about that. I didn't, because the truth is the countries of Southeast Asia aren't going to choose between the United States and China. There's no reason to. And they all benefit from working with China and working with the United States. So I always thought that's kind of a false choice. And it's more meant to say, don't put us in a position where you're saying, well, you have to do this vis-a-vis China. You have to tell the Chinese blah, 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 blah. It's more that than we're actually going to choose, because it makes no sense for them to choose one or the other.
Right. I completely didn't even think of that, and it makes sense to me. So I see both questions in the chat boxes and the Q&A, and I'm seeing both of them, so don't worry, you can post them wherever. But I'm going to stick on the Q&A questions because it's about Indonesia, and I'm just going to try to keep threads going. So there's two questions on Indonesia. One of them from Ahito here at UH. It says that you, recognizing that you were an ambassador in Indonesia during the I've been mostly trained by Indonesianists, and I was always so focused on Myanmar and trying to pronounce Burmese names. Thank you. During his presidency, what was your assessment of given that, what's your assessment of the recent elections in Indonesia? What does that say about Indonesia? What does it mean for U.S. Indonesia relations? And another question from William is wanting to know what the change in administration will mean with foreign policy towards Burma.
Okay. On Indonesia, I mean, the Indonesians have run pretty good elections for the last 15, 20 years. And so I think the elections themselves were, as far as I know, free and fair. I know there were some concerns about them, but overall, I think Indonesia has been pretty good on that front. I think Prabowo prevailed according to everything I've heard and read, because he had the support of a very popular outgoing president, Jokowi, and pledged to continue Jokowi's policies. And he also did a pretty good job of kind of remaking his own image, which had been not very good, into a sort of warm, cuddly uncle figure. So I think that's the reality, and it reflects the politics of today, where people use social media and other mechanisms to create an image of themselves. I mean, Bongbong Marcos reportedly got elected in the Philippines a few years ago, in part because he was able to really remake his image and his family's image significantly. As for what it means for U.S.-Indonesian relations, I think both sides will be pragmatic. I think, U.S. is on the record of having been pretty unhappy with Prabowo in the past over human rights violations, but then dealt with him as defense minister and has congratulated him on his victory. So I think the U.S. will certainly want to continue to work with Indonesia. Prabowo, I can't say what's in his mind, but from everything I've heard, he's going to play a bigger role in foreign policy. In that sense, he might be like Yudhoyono, wanting to emphasize that aspect of his tenure more than say Jokowi did, and want to sort of work to make sure that Indonesia is a serious player internationally. I would assume, therefore, that he's going to want to work with China, the U.S., Japan, and ASEAN, and everybody else. So I wouldn't anticipate any dramatic changes as a result of that. On the second question on a change of administrations, what it would mean for Burma policy, again, speculation. I would think Harris administration would be more continuity. Again, depends on who they put in place. Part of the challenge on a country like Myanmar is for years there were champions of Burma or Myanmar in Washington, in administrations or on the Hill. Mitch McConnell, other members of Congress, Laura Bush, when George W. Bush was president, was a big Burma person, and sort of, even though she wasn't holding an elected office, she was the first lady, and when she was interested, it meant we were all interested. I'm not sure that there's a champion now, so it all depends on whether President Harris or President Trump might. I don't think they would necessarily put someone in a position, appoint someone because they're a Burma, they have a Burma interest. But it's if they happen to appoint someone who does have a Burma interest, then that could lead to a lot more attention. Otherwise, I think with Harris, it's more of the same, maybe with some gradually increasing attention. With Trump administration, hard for me to see them paying a lot of attention, frankly.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Moving on to other questions. This one is from Miriam, who introduced us at the beginning of the panel. Given it's referring to the Asia Foundation report, the link is in the chat box for everyone, that Scott was a part of, and it just got launched, as I understand. So in that report, it contends that the U.S. needs an affirmative economic strategy that reflects the vital importance of Southeast Asia to the U.S. So do you, Scott, think that the U.S. should consider finding some strategy to either join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership or initiate an entirely different new economic relationship with ASEAN? And if so, what might that new agreement look like?
Yeah, I would love to see us join the CPTPP. But from everything I've heard from the people who know Washington best, that seems really unlikely, just because of the politics aren't behind a trade agreement that would require us to do major tariff reductions. So that would be ideal, but unlikely. So absent that, and what the report that came out today from the Asia Foundation recommends, sorry, I shouldn't say it's under the auspices of the Asia Foundation, but it's an independent report, recommends sort of what's politically feasible. And so they talk about, a digital trade agreement, building on something that ASEAN's already negotiating among themselves. It's talking about, parts of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, trying to firm those up and get some deals to facilitate trade and investment. It talks about possible critical mineral deals, particularly with Indonesia, the Philippines, maybe Vietnam, so that their critical minerals could come into the United States and benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits, those sorts of things. So it's kind of looking at what's actually politically possible. And I think any and all of those things would be really good. And then, as I mentioned earlier, working harder to fund our commitments to the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in Indonesia. There's also one with Vietnam. That's an opportunity for us to contribute on an important goal on clean energy and climate change, but in doing so, also show that we can deliver on infrastructure in a way that enhances U.S. credibility in the region.
Thank you for that. There are, I cannot deny the line of questions that are specifically about Myanmar. So that's what we're turning to next. Presumably that was your last post. So I'm just going to give you them all at once. First, there's a Burmese student who's studying in the U.S. and actually, I can't say that I agree with her assessment empirically. She says, I've noticed the withdrawal of scholarships for students from Burma. How do you think the lack of education, that's the part I'm not totally sure that I agree with. But how do you think the lack of educational opportunities will affect the young people who want to study overseas in the future? The reason why I wanted to ask this is it really gets to this issue of just like, we do not want a lost generation in Myanmar with the lack of educational opportunities. So, what can more be done in that regard? So that's one question on Myanmar. Another one is on U.S. engagement with Myanmar, which you mentioned before, is the one exception to not engage is the correct answer there. And so this person was kind of wanting you to maybe talk more about that and again, what the next administration in the U.S. could mean for engagement in Myanmar. So that's another one. Then Yasin Arfat wants just you to talk about the Rohingya crisis, and you talk about it at great length in your book. So I actually think that is a really important topic to talk about, not only because of the Rohingya crisis, but because you give a lot of attention to that in the Myanmar chapter. So I think, yes, those are I believe, the Myanmar questions that are up right now.
Okay, good. Always happy to talk about Myanmar. On the first question on education scholarships, I haven't heard that the U.S. government is cutting any scholarship programs. I'd be very surprised. I had not heard that. It could be that some universities are not, but the universities operate independently, so that wouldn't be any kind of systematic approach. But the bigger point is the serious risk of a lost education when you combine COVID, then the coup and all the violence and the shutting of many schools and what have you, and then difficulty with getting overseas education opportunities. It is a really problematic one of many really problematic situations and issues in Myanmar. So I fully support the international community in the U.S. doing more to try to create opportunities for Burmese students, Myanmar students, to come here. I'm on the board of a small foundation in California that does nothing but that. I know there's a lot of effort being made in places in Thailand, whether it's Chulalongkorn, University of Chiang Mai, other places, to try to create some opportunities. Also, Parami Institute doing a lot of really good work, but there's clearly more that needs to be done. And of course, it's not just at the university level; it's at all levels. It's terrible. I don't know what else to say on that. On the second question on engagement, when I talk about engaging with Myanmar, I think I'd separate out, just to be clear, engaging with the generals and the SAC is what I was talking about when I was saying we shouldn't be engaging. Now, I'm
sorry, I kind of that's what the person who asked the question meant. It was my misreading of that. He was referring to Naypyidaw engagement, which would mean.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that it's not bad to have a line of communication to the SAC at lower levels. Meaning no photo ops, no newspaper stories, but you just have a channel of communication. I think that's useful to do, just in case things begin to change. You want to have a channel of communication, but you don't want to have the big shot visitors to Naypyidaw, photograph, shaking hands with, General Min Aung Hlaing, or or going in there and trying to say, let's get a political dialogue going. I think that's not the right move. But there should be a lot of engagement with other elements in Myanmar, certainly the NUG, the ethnic armed groups, civil society, as much as possible. I'm on record saying that we should be doing more to support efforts to build local governance, and even to help the resistance, maybe not with lethal weapons, but at least with communications equipment and these sorts of things. If again, I'm not a military expert, but to the extent there's equipment that might help protect people against bombing raids, helicopters, that sort of thing. So that there should be a lot of engagement. It's specifically with the SAC that it should be very limited at a lower level. And then the third question, sorry, I forgot the third question.
Rohingya.
Oh, Rohingya. Yeah, how could I forget that? I mean, that was in my 37-year career, that was the most painful and difficult experience I ever had. And I want to be clear here. What the pain and difficulty I suffered was nothing compared to obviously what the Rohingya community suffered, but just seeing it and trying so hard, myself and many others, to get the government and the military to change its approach, and just beating our heads against a brick wall was the most frustrating, maddening, painful experience of my diplomatic career. You know, it's so deeply tied to some misperceptions and disinformation and prejudices within Myanmar society that have been built up over the years of, you know, the national races versus other races. The Rohingya is somehow being perceived or portrayed as some kind of threat to the Buddhist soul of Myanmar and what have you. It was really deep. And one of the most tragic things about it was obviously the military were the ones carrying out these horrific operations. But seeing the lack of sympathy and support for the Rohingya in the broader community was deeply troubling. And it made me think of our own experience with racism in the United States and how so many people were okay with it, and some sadly still are. And that's just a lot even harder issue to get at, because it's about changing attitudes in society that have been formed over maybe a long period of time through a lot of misinformation and prejudices that have gone down. So I'm talking more about the sort of emotional and mental side of it. In terms of the policy side, obviously we had been trying even before then to try to get the government to dismantle what was effectively a system of apartheid that was imposed on the Rohingya people. You had a Kofi Annan commission of some really good people, and Kofi Annan I had great respect for, who came up with specific recommendations that were really pragmatic and could have been helpful. And then just the lack of political will to implement those in the country. Certainly the military being the worst, but plenty of others who were not willing to do much to address the issue. And as a result, just, unimaginable levels of suffering by hundreds of thousands of people who are still, for the most part, in camps in Bangladesh. The way forward, I mean, it has to start with, one, an end to the conflict in Myanmar and the military no longer being in charge. Without that, I don't see how you really make any progress. Then you need to have more of what we've seen the beginnings of, which is a change in attitudes among at least some people in Myanmar toward the Rohingya. And three, then you need to figure out what's Rakhine going to look like with the Arakan army and that, what specifically, how can the Rakhine people, the Rohingya people, the Myanmar people come up with some realistic way to reintegrate the Rohingya in a way that doesn't, lead to yet another spasm of violence. Really tough challenge, but critical, absolutely critical.
Thanks for that. I mean, you were in such a unique situation of being the ambassador in Myanmar during that time. I'm sure you could speak so much more to that. But uh, I missed one of the Myanmar questions, and the author of that question wanted to make sure that I did not did not forget. And I want to ask this because I think it really is very important, and it's actually largely how I got to know you, Scott. Which is about the national peace process.
Mhm.
And but the question is specifically about the NLD regarding that peace process during their tenure in government. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, when I got there in 2016, the peace process had largely stalled. You'd had this effort under Thein Sein that seemed to have some momentum, but then the military, refused to include some of the pretty critical groups, and then even as they tried to move it forward, the military basically blocked the sort of national dialogues and so on that were supposed to be fundamental parts of the peace process. So it lost momentum. My sense was that the NLD, speaking very honestly, just didn't seem to put a lot of muscle into this and brain power. I don't know. I mean, um, they just didn't seem to be devoting a lot of energy to it, and a lot of creativity. And my I'll get in trouble with a lot of people for saying this, but a criticism of Aung San Suu Kyi, for whom I have tremendous respect, was she didn't, she could have, I think, led the way a little bit more in terms of talking about what a future federal Myanmar might have involved, and highlighting respect for the cultures and languages and the histories of the different ethnic minority groups. Given her popularity, I was disappointed that she didn't do more in that front. I'm not saying she could have solved all the problems, but there wasn't there wasn't any vision presented about what this could look like. Um, and I think that was a missed opportunity. And now with the national uprising, the revolution, whatever you want to call it, all the old power centers are being upended, and nobody knows how this is going to play out. It is tragic what's happening, but it's also an opportunity to try to get at this from a different angle, with the ethnic armed groups having more leverage. And it's going to be tricky, but that leverage, to a certain extent, I think is necessary to get the level of autonomy that might be durable. At the same time, it's really important that it not lead to breaking away from the union. So it's going to be a really tricky situation, to say the least.
Indeed. Um, Okay, I have one question on Singapore and two more about ASEAN, and that will take us to the close. So I want to ask this question on Singapore because it is notably absent in your book.
Mm-hmm.
You also don't, to the best of my knowledge, didn't have any diplomatic experience in the country, so perhaps that's why it's not in the book. But Jim Forbes, who says hello,
Hi, Jim.
you. um, his question is on so Lee, Go, and Lee were good friends of the U.S., but Wong has been not has been as warm towards the U.S. So his question is, does the U.S. need to change anything in its approach to Singapore, considering its importance in security, trade, and law enforcement in the region?
Yeah. First, I'll just briefly say, yeah, I didn't write chapters on Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei or Laos, not because they're not important, but they weren't countries I had served in, or countries where I had really spent the bulk of my time. I certainly was in Singapore many times, and always valued my discussions with the Singaporeans. But the truth was, there weren't that many pressing issues in the bilateral relationship with Singapore. In terms of Jim's question, I'm sure there's always things we could be doing better. I think I'm not worried about the new prime minister. I don't know him personally, but I knowing Singapore, I'm pretty confident that they will be very pragmatic, realistic, and remain a good friend to the United States. One of the things that will be very important is making sure that whoever wins the next election nominates and gets an ambassador out there quickly. We have not always been very good at that lately. So that's critical, and continue to listen. And I think also Singapore's changing itself, and so they're going to have to deal with some new challenges. And I think they're very capable and don't necessarily need our help, but it's important that we stay very carefully attuned to that, to the extent that that may influence their foreign policy. But overall, I won't say there's nothing we should do differently, but I would think it's relatively, more doing the things we should be doing all the time and making sure we're consistent.
So in our last few minutes, let's turn to ASEAN. When I read, which I believe is the last or second last chapter in your book, I was wanting for my mind to be changed about ASEAN, and frankly speaking, it wasn't. It's a hard sell for me. There's basically the questions in ASEAN, of which there's like 2 or 3 in here. Essentially, just want you to speak about U.S. ASEAN engagements, what it could mean, what it should mean, and also interesting. Someone's talking about kind of the deployment of the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. Branding rather than Asia-Pacific, and what that also means vis-a-vis ASEAN.
Yeah. ASEAN, first of the Indo-Pacific, I mean, I don't know. I have a hard time getting excited about these things. It was mostly, I think, reflecting the role of India, the growing role of India, and wanting to look at the region as, the broader region. It certainly wasn't meant to take away from ASEAN in any respect, but looking, I think, geostrategically at the entire Indo-Pacific, which actually, I mean, it was Indonesian Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa, who, at least for me, the first I heard that term was from him, the Indo-Pacific region, not from the U.S. So maybe we owe Marty a fine for copyright violation. So like I said, maybe it's just me, but I have a hard time getting particularly excited about these semantic changes. It was more relative, I suppose, for our military, where the Pacific Command became the Indo-Pacific Command, although I'm not sure it actually encompassed any more countries. But it's just to show that we meant that whole broad region. In terms of ASEAN, yeah, ASEAN's just such a unique institution. And I think everyone who's worked on ASEAN, including many of my friends in Southeast Asia, are frustrated and have been frustrated with ASEAN because of all the things that it hasn't been able to do. It hasn't been able to really address the Myanmar issue. It hasn't really been able to show unity on the South China Sea, those sorts of things. And that's just fact. I think it's important to understand, why ASEAN matters, while recognizing its very significant limitations. And why does it matter? Firstly, why was it put together? It was partly out of concern about the spread of communism in the 1960s, but also it was post-Sukarno and post-confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, to put in place a mechanism so that the countries of the region could work out their own differences and overcome their own mistrust. And in that sense, it's been extremely successful. Right, you haven't had a conflict among ASEAN countries, I believe, since the founding. So that's been very interesting. Second, the other thing that ASEAN does it's moving ahead in a lot of technical and scientific and economic commercial areas. Harmonizing standards, moving to a uniform customs form. All this. None of it's very exciting or headline grabbing, but it's incremental, removal of barriers and so encouraging trade and investment among the region. I think it's again slow progress, but it has been pretty steady. Third, I think ASEAN has successfully positioned itself as when people talk about ASEAN centrality, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, but one of the things it has done is create this concentric circles of these institutions. The ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN +3, East Asia Summit, which if you're not in the diplomacy business, it's like, oh, it's all nonsense. But why it matters, and I've been to a lot of ASEAN meetings, and they're mostly boring as all get out. But what they do is they bring countries together. And the formal meetings themselves often don't accomplish a whole lot. But what's really important is all the discussions on the side. And particularly for the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit, you get the U.S., China, Russia, all the ASEAN countries, Australia, Japan, Korea together in one meeting to talk, but then there's all kinds of side meetings going on. And that's really important, particularly in a time of high U.S. China tensions. There's not that many opportunities for the presidents to meet and to try to, cool the temperature a little bit, even if they don't solve all the problems. And if ASEAN didn't host these meetings, I don't think they'd happen, because ASEAN has the advantage of not being threatening to anybody. So if the U.S. were to call a meeting, maybe the Chinese wouldn't come, and vice versa, that sort of thing. With ASEAN, everyone feels comfortable coming, and so it's very useful. It's also a way to engage with all of the ASEAN countries at one time. It's often difficult for the U.S. to get a Secretary of State or a president to go halfway around the world for a formal meeting, a formal ASEAN-U.S. meeting. It's usually not that exciting, but and they say you have an opportunity to meet with this president and this prime minister and do this and do that. It's extremely useful. So yes, ASEAN is frustrating, and I think you just have to say ASEAN is necessary, even if it's frustrating in its limitations.
Thanks. It's almost like their weakness is their strength in that matter, in terms of their convening power.
Yeah.
So we're 5 minutes over, which I think is okay. This was really fun. Ambassador Marciel, you were very generous with your time, and I really appreciated your candid remarks to my questions, and I'm really thankful to the participants who joined in their questions that helped fill in many of the gaps in the questions that I had for you. And I want to thank everyone for joining and for making this happen. And let's keep these conversations going. I don't know if if Miriam or if anyone needs to have any last announcements before we close, or I'm the closer. Okay, Miriam says no need. So I thank you for everyone for joining, and please take note of future webinars that the Center for Southeast Asia Studies is hosting, and please join us again. So thank you, Ambassador Marciel.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. Take care.
Bye.